a black woman was erased from the guest list, but her billionaire husband made them regret it. It was the most anticipated event of the year, the grand charity gala hosted by the city's elite, where invitations were as coveted as the jewels worn by the guests. Eleanor Jackson, a well-known philanthropist, businesswoman, and the wife of billionaire CEO Marcus Jackson, had attended the event for years, her presence always welcomed with open arms. The Jacksons had long been contributors to the event's success, not just through monetary donations, but through their dedication to causes that uplifted underprivileged communities. But this year, something was different. Eleanor, who was busy sorting through her messages on her phone as she prepared for the gala, paused when she saw an email from the event organizers. She had already confirmed her attendance months ago, but the message she opened contained a statement she never expected. "We regret to inform you that your invitation to this year's gala has been removed from the guest list. We apologize for any inconvenience." The words hit her like a blow. Her heart sank as confusion turned to anger. She reread the email several times, wondering if she had misinterpreted it. How could this happen? She was one of the event's longest supporters, and her husband, Marcus, was always a key figure in the organization. The Jackson name alone carried weight in high society. "Shh, hi, I just received an email stating my invitation has been removed from the guest list. What's going on?" Eleanor's voice was calm but betrayed her frustration. On the other end, the organizer stammered, I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson, but there seems to have been an issue. There's no explanation, but the list has been finalized, and, unfortunately, your name was omitted." Eleanor's mind was spinning. Omitted? How could that happen? "I'm truly sorry, Ms. Jackson. It was an error, but we can't change the list at this point." The apology sounded empty, and Eleanor's blood boiled as she realized something wasn't right. The tone of the conversation seemed dismissive, and she could sense something more behind the words. She tried to ask for an explanation, but the organizer had no clear answers. They could only offer a vague apology and assured her that no one else was affected. She hung up, disbelief settling in. The more she thought about it, the more she realized something was wrong. This wasn't just a mistake. This felt deliberate. Eleanor stood by the window, looking out over the city skyline as her mind whirled. She had always been aware of the subtle racism that lingered in certain circles, even in the most prestigious spaces. She had faced it before, though it had been more insidious, disguised as polite indifference or veiled condescension. But this felt different. This was an outright rejection. Her mind flashed to the moment when she and Marcus had planned to attend the gala together. Marcus, being the successful CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech company, had always been a respected figure in the community. He was constantly involved in charity events, contributing both his wealth and his influence to causes he believed in. But for the first time, Eleanor felt like her presence at an event, despite all her contributions, didn't matter. Suddenly the phone rang again. It was Marcus. "Eleanor, what's going on? Why aren't we on the guest list?" His voice was filled with confusion and anger. Eleanor quickly explained the situation, detailing the unceremonious email and her suspicions. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Marcus spoke again. "Don't worry, Eleanor, I'll handle this. This isn't just about a missed invitation. We're going to find out what's really going on." With Marcus on her side, Eleanor felt a sense of reassurance. She knew that his influence, his position, would ensure that this wouldn't be swept under the rug. But as they discussed their next steps, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple mistake. Someone had intentionally erased her from the list, and they would soon realize that this wasn't a fight she was going to back down from. The following morning, Eleanor received a call she hadn't expected. It wasn't from the event organizers or any of the high society figures she normally interacted with. No, this time it was from her husband Marcus, who, as promised, had already begun to investigate what had transpired. "I've spoken to some people in the network," Marcus said, his voice low but controlled. "It turns out this isn't just a mistake. Someone decided to pull the strings to remove your name from that guest list." Eleanor's chest tightened. "What do you mean? Who would do something like this?" Marcus sighed, clearly frustrated. "From what I've gathered, a few of the committee members have been trying to prevent certain people from attending, and I believe your involvement in the gala might have made some people uncomfortable. But it's more than that. I think someone has an issue with you, specifically." She paused, processing his words. The idea that someone might deliberately target her, erase her from an event she had supported for years was hard to fathom, but as the events began to unfold, she realized that this was more than just a personal grievance. It was part of something larger, something she wasn't quite prepared for. "Have you spoken to the organizers?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'm on it," Marcus replied, "but I think it's clear now that this wasn't a simple error. It was calculated. The situation had escalated beyond an innocent mistake." The more Marcus investigated, the more he realized that Eleanor's exclusion from the guest list was connected to something deeper within the social elite circles. As he dug into the backgrounds of some of the gala's key organizers, he began to uncover troubling details. Some members of the gala's committee had long-standing biases. It was a mixture of overt and covert racism, a dangerous undercurrent in the world of wealth and privilege, but it had always remained behind closed doors. Eleanor had always been conscious of the subtle ways racism and prejudice reared their heads in these circles, but she had never thought it would affect her so directly. She had worked so hard to be accepted in these spaces, even when it meant enduring the occasional condescending comment or discriminatory remark disguised as politeness. She had learned to rise above it. But this time it felt different. This time they had taken action. The more she thought about it, the more it began to feel personal. She had contributed so much to the event over the years, not just financially, but through her time, her connections, and her commitment to charity. And yet, someone had erased her name from the guest list as though she was disposable, as though she didn't belong. Marcus had always been the kind of man who approached problems with logic and determination, but even he was taken aback by the depths of this betrayal. He knew that what had happened to Eleanor wasn't just about one person's grudge. It was about an entire system that had long maintained its power by keeping people like her in the shadows. As they sat down together that night, Eleanor began to feel the weight of what had happened. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been excluded, silenced, or pushed aside simply because they didn't fit the image of what the elite thought should be in their spaces. Marcus reached across the table, his hand warm against hers. "We're going to fix this," he said with quiet resolve. "I don't care how deep this runs or how powerful these people think they are. No one, and I mean no one, gets to erase you from this." His words were a balm to her spirit, but the fight had only just begun. As they prepared to confront the organizers, Eleanor knew that the battle wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be quick. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about the gala. This was about standing up to a system that had kept people like her out for far too long. And with Marcus by her side, she was ready to make them regret their actions. The day after Marcus uncovered the truth, he wasted no time in making sure they would take action. He arranged a meeting with the event organizers, though Eleanor wasn't certain what to expect. She had hoped for an apology, perhaps an explanation. but deep down she knew that this wouldn't be a simple conversation. This wasn't just about fixing an error. It was about facing the deeply rooted prejudices that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Marcus had set the meeting for the afternoon at a prestigious downtown office building, a place where the city's most powerful had their headquarters. Eleanor and Marcus walked through the towering glass doors, their presence commanding attention. Eleanor, although nervous, knew this was the moment to make sure they were heard. As they stepped into the elevator, her mind raced. The meeting would be held in a private conference room, with a handful of the gala committee's members in attendance. The room was sleek and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. It was exactly the kind of space you would expect from people who thrived on their exclusivity and wealth. It was all too perfect, a perfect place to hide behind polished facades and silken words. But Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. Marcus and Eleanor took their seats at the long marble table where the members of the committee were already waiting for them. The moment they sat down, Eleanor immediately noticed the tension in the air. A few of the organizers, whose names she recognized from past galas, exchanged uncomfortable glances. The room seemed to shrink, as if everyone was silently bracing for the storm that was about to unfold. The lead organizer, a woman named Suzanne Caldwell, who had been overseeing the gala for years, cleared her throat and began with an air of false politeness. "Eleanor, Marcus, thank you for meeting with us today. We understand there's been some confusion about your invitation." Eleanor didn't allow her to finish. "No, Suzanne, this isn't about confusion. This is about something much deeper." She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "You took me off the guest list without reason, and you thought I wouldn't notice, but I'm here to make sure everyone understands exactly why." Suzanne's face paled slightly, and she looked toward the other members, as if trying to find support. There was a slight quiver in her voice when she spoke again. "We understand your frustration, but there must be some misunderstanding. The guest list is always—" "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding," Eleanor cut in. "The real issue here is that you and your committee don't think I belong in the room with you. You didn't just forget me. You intentionally erased me, and I'm here to understand why." The room fell silent. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't tell if anyone was going to speak. But then one of the committee members, a man named Robert Harris, who owned a high-end clothing brand, finally broke the silence. His voice was laced with condescension. "We didn't expect someone like you to understand the intricacies of such an event. You might not realize the kind of impact your presence could have on the overall atmosphere." Eleanor clenched her fists under the table, trying to keep her composure. She wasn't about to let this man diminish her in front of Marcus or anyone else in the room. "What impact is that, Robert? The fact that I'm black? That my presence somehow disturbs the atmosphere of your precious event?" Eleanor's voice remained steady, but the words were sharp, and every syllable pierced through the room's facade. The tension in the room thickened as the other committee members looked around, unwilling to speak. Marcus, sitting silently beside Eleanor, finally spoke. "You can hide behind your polite words all you want, but we both know the truth. This wasn't just about a mistake on the guest list. This was about your bias, your assumptions." There was a pause, and Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He knew, just as everyone else in the room did, that Marcus wasn't speaking lightly. Marcus Jackson wasn't just a billionaire businessman. His influence extended far beyond the world of tech. His connections could shape the course of industries, and those in this room who had underestimated Eleanor and Marcus now realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. Eleanor's eyes were unwavering as she stared directly at Suzanne. "You will publicly apologize," she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And you will reinstate my invitation, but that's just the beginning. I want a full acknowledgement of your actions, and I want you to make a commitment that nothing like this will happen again." Suzanne's eyes shifted nervously. She had underestimated Eleanor, and now the price of that mistake was becoming clear. After a few moments of silence, Suzanne finally spoke, her voice trembling. We will apologize, but please understand, this isn't how we intended for this to play out." Eleanor nodded slowly, but her words were unwavering. "No, it's exactly how you intended, but that's about to change." Marcus gave Eleanor's hand a reassuring squeeze. "We're not leaving here without your full acknowledgement. We'll make sure the world knows what happened here today." The committee members knew this was the end of the road for them. With Marcus and Eleanor at the helm, the path forward was clear. They would make sure the mistakes of the past were never repeated, and that justice would prevail. The room remained silent for a few moments after Marcus and Eleanor had made their demands clear. Suzanne, her face flushed with anxiety, seemed unsure of how to respond. She had hoped this would blow over without incident, but the weight of the moment had made her realize that it was no longer in her control. Marcus's influence was undeniable. The gravity of the situation was sinking in for the committee members. The Jackson name was powerful, but it wasn't just the name. It was the cause they were supporting. Eleanor wasn't just a donor or a celebrity guest anymore. She was a symbol, a reminder that people could no longer hide behind their biases or exclusionary practices. The entire city had watched this unfold, and now they would have to answer for their actions. Suzanne straightened in her chair, pushing her hair behind her ear. I apologize, Eleanor," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "This was an oversight, but I realize now that it was more than that. It was wrong, and I deeply regret it." Eleanor's eyes never left Suzanne's face. She had heard apologies before, empty ones, ones that meant nothing. She could tell that Suzanne was genuinely apologetic, but Eleanor wasn't in the mood for empty words. "An apology is a start," Eleanor said calmly, "but it's only the beginning. You will make a public statement acknowledging what happened here. You will own your mistake, and you will reinstate my invitation to the gala. You will also address the other members of your committee and make sure this doesn't happen again." The other committee members, who had been quietly observing, exchanged uncertain glances. There was no turning back now. Suzanne nodded, but it was clear she wasn't thrilled about the idea. "We will do that," she said, though her voice still held a tremor. "I'll speak to the committee members, and we'll issue a formal statement." "And we want the media to know," Eleanor added, her voice firm. "This is not just about me. This is about making it clear to the public that these types of actions will not be tolerated. This is about accountability, and it's about change." For a moment, the room was filled with an uncomfortable quiet. The power dynamic had shifted. The ball was now in their court, and they knew it. Suzanne cleared her throat, seemingly regaining a bit of her composure. "We will do what you ask. We'll make sure that this is publicly acknowledged." As Suzanne spoke, one of the other committee members, a wealthy businessman by the name of Edward Banks, spoke up hesitantly. "I think we all recognize the seriousness of this, but I have to admit I didn't fully understand the weight of the situation until now." Eleanor nodded, her expression softening just a little. "Thank you for acknowledging that, Edward. This isn't just a personal matter for me. It's about everyone who's ever been excluded, erased, or made to feel invisible because of their race. I can't do this alone, and I shouldn't have to, but I'm not going to back down." Edward shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, but also seemingly ready to change his perspective. "We understand, Eleanor. I think we all do now. With the apology out of the way and the promises made, the meeting seemed to draw to a close, but Eleanor wasn't done yet. "One last thing," she said, her voice steady. "You need to implement an anti-discrimination policy in your organization. No more overlooking these issues. Make sure everyone involved in your event understands that this behavior is unacceptable." Suzanne's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. "We will. You have my word." Eleanor stood up, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. As Marcus stood beside her, she could see that the committee members knew they had been caught, and they would now be held accountable. Walking out of the meeting room, Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a quiet, meaningful glance. It wasn't over. It would never be over, but they had made progress. They had fought back against an injustice and forced those responsible to confront their own biases. Eleanor knew that the real challenge lay ahead. This was just one battle in a much larger war. But as they left the building, there was a new sense of optimism in the air. For the first time, Eleanor could truly see the beginning of something significant. The fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been silenced, excluded, and dismissed. It was a fight for justice, and they were just getting started. The days following the meeting with the gala's committee were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor had kept her promise to hold them accountable, and the media quickly latched onto the story. Headlines appeared across the city, detailing the wrongful exclusion and the promises made by the event organizers to rectify their mistake. The public apology was issued, and the media circus that followed was both a victory and a reminder of how far things still had to go. But what was most gratifying for Eleanor was seeing the ripple effect. As the story spread, it became clear that the issue was far from unique. People from different walks of life came forward, sharing their own stories of exclusion, discrimination, and the hidden prejudices that still lingered in high society. It was as though the dam had broken, and suddenly the floodgates were open. Social media exploded with posts from individuals calling for change in their own workplaces, schools, and communities. Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. The spotlight was on the gala, yes, but the real work was about turning this moment into a movement. She spent her time meeting with activists, engaging with leaders in the community, and pushing for systemic change within the industries where she had influence. She wasn't just focused on the gala anymore. This was about broader social reform. But as the momentum grew, Eleanor faced a new challenge. There were powerful people who didn't want this conversation to happen. The resistance was palpable. In private meetings, she encountered people who agreed with her publicly, but worked behind closed doors to minimize the impact. They wanted to talk, sure, but only to a certain extent. They didn't want real change. They wanted the conversation to go away. And that was exactly why Eleanor couldn't stop. The moment she did, the voices of those who had been silenced would be drowned out again. It wasn't long before Sarah, a longtime friend and supporter of Eleanor's work, called her with an update. "Eleanor, I've been talking to a few people at the event. They're saying things like, it was a one-time error, and we've learned from our mistake. But they haven't really changed anything yet. There's no real policy, no genuine commitment. It's all just window dressing." Eleanor sighed, rubbing her temples. "I knew it. I thought we could push them to do more, but this is what we're up against. They'll try to make it look like they've learned something, but in the end, it's about what they're willing to change." "You're right," Sarah agreed. "It's not enough to apologize. They need to show real action." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "But it's hard to make them change when they're so comfortable with the status quo." The frustration was evident in her voice, but Sarah's response was firm. "You've started something big, Eleanor. Don't let them off the hook. They won't change without pressure. It's up to people like you to make sure this moment counts." It was a reminder Eleanor needed. She couldn't afford to let the momentum slip away. There was so much more work to do. The gala was just one event, but the issue of racial inequality was widespread across industries, communities, and even government. The fight for true equality couldn't be confined to one conversation or a single movement. It had to be everywhere. A week later, Eleanor attended a town hall meeting focused on racial justice and systemic change. She sat in the front row listening as speakers presented their views on policy reform, police accountability, and how to create more inclusive communities. The discussions were passionate, and Eleanor couldn't help but feel encouraged by the growing number of people who had joined the cause. As she listened to the speakers and engaged with the crowd, she realized that it wasn't just about pushing the elites to change. It was about empowering everyone to demand change. The momentum wasn't just top-down. It had to be grassroots. She had to find a way to make everyone feel like they had a stake in the fight. This was not just about her or Marcus or the media. This was about everyone who had ever felt the sting of inequality, who had been excluded from spaces because of their race or background. By the end of the meeting, Eleanor knew that the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. There were still challenges ahead, still resistance to face. But for the first time in months, she felt something more than frustration. She felt hope. And it wasn't a fleeting hope. It was the kind that came from seeing change begin to take shape. The journey ahead was long, but Eleanor was ready for it. As the weeks went by, the events surrounding the gala and Eleanor's public confrontation with the organizers had ripple effects that extended far beyond the event itself. The media attention was only the beginning. Eleanor had started something much larger, a wave of change that was both powerful and frightening to those who had long held power in elite circles. And where there is change, there is often resistance. The backlash came swiftly. A small but vocal group of high-profile figures within the city's elite community began to speak out against the movement. They argued that the focus on racial bias was misplaced, that the accusations were overblown, and that the legacy of the gala and its organizers had been tarnished unjustly. It wasn't just the gala organizers who felt the heat. Several influential business leaders and socialites voiced their displeasure. They claimed that the event had been a tradition that shouldn't be sullied by what they called political correctness. Sarah, Eleanor's close friend and an activist in her own right, was on the front lines of the backlash. As one of the most vocal supporters of Eleanor's push for racial equality, she had become a target for those who wished to maintain the status quo. Threatening phone calls, social media attacks, and even anonymous letters started to flood her inbox. Despite the hostile environment, Sarah remained steadfast, but Eleanor, although resilient, couldn't ignore the weight of it all. It wasn't just about the gala anymore, it was a personal fight. The more she tried to push for change, the more she realized how deeply entrenched the biases were in the very institution she had once worked alongside. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in her office, preparing for yet another interview with a journalist, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from Marcus. His voice was tense. "You need to come to the office," he said quickly. "Something's going on, and I think you should hear it directly from me." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice betraying the anxiety she was trying to suppress. "I can't go into detail over the phone. Just come. It's important." Eleanor agreed, and within an hour she was sitting across from Marcus in his private office. The door closed behind her. Marcus looked different. There was a shadow in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "There's been some fallout," Marcus began, his hands clasped together in front of him. "I knew things would get heated, but this is something else." Eleanor frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Some of the people behind the backlash are starting to target us directly. I've been receiving threats, anonymous emails, some from high-ranking people in the business world. They want us to stop pushing for these changes. They want us to stay quiet." Eleanor's heart sank as she listened. This wasn't just about opposing views or public debates. This was about silencing them, about putting an end to the progress they had fought so hard for. "Who are they?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus sighed, looking down at the papers scattered across his desk. "People who feel threatened, people who want to maintain control. And it's not just happening here. We've seen it in other industries too. The political machine is involved." Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't just about a few hurt feelings. There were powerful people at play, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on society's most lucrative and influential circles. "Are you scared?" Eleanor asked, her voice full of concern. Marcus met her gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I won't back down. We won't back down. But we have to be careful. The opposition is powerful, and they don't hesitate to use every resource at their disposal." Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She had always known that the fight for racial justice wasn't going to be easy, but now it felt like they were up against something much larger than they had initially realized. The rest of the meeting was filled with talk of strategy. Marcus had already hired extra security, and they discussed ways to protect themselves from the growing threats. But despite the fear, Eleanor felt a sense of resolve settle over her. They had come too far to turn back now. It wasn't just about one gala or one event. It was about taking on an entire system of oppression that had been silently maintained for generations. They would face these challenges head on, and as Eleanor left Marcus's office, a new sense of purpose washed over her. No matter the obstacles, she was ready. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she would see it through to the end. The months that followed the intense backlash were difficult, but necessary. Eleanor and Marcus continued their fight, but now they were more prepared. The resistance they had encountered made them even more determined to see through the changes they had started. However, the attacks they faced weren't without consequences. They both felt the strain on their mental health, on their relationship, and on their professional lives. But there was one thing that kept them moving forward: the progress they had begun to make. The first major breakthrough came unexpectedly. Eleanor had been invited to speak at a high-profile event organized by a coalition of civil rights groups. It wasn't a gala or a corporate-sponsored event, but rather a grassroots gathering of individuals who shared the same goal: racial justice. At the event, Eleanor was given the floor to share her story, the story of how she was erased from the guest list, how she fought back, and how, despite the resistance, the fight was far from over. The room, filled with activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens, listened attentively as Eleanor spoke. Her words were powerful, not because of the injustices she had faced, but because of the resilience she had shown in the face of it all. After her speech, she was approached by several individuals who worked in the media, eager to interview her and learn more about her journey. The media coverage that followed was unlike anything she had experienced before. Stories about her actions went viral, sparking a national conversation about race, exclusion, and the role of the elite in perpetuating inequality. For the first time, it felt as though the conversation was shifting. People who had previously been passive were now actively engaging in the discussion. More importantly, politicians and influential business leaders, those who had once been indifferent, began to take notice. They started reaching out, wanting to know how they could contribute to the cause. But there was still more work to be done. One of the most surprising outcomes of Eleanor's speech was the number of law enforcement officers who contacted her after the event, expressing support for the cause. These were individuals who had once been part of the system she was fighting against. They told her they had been inspired by her courage and were now looking for ways to address racial biases within their own ranks. At first, Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of this. She had been skeptical of law enforcement for so long, but these conversations began to spark a glimmer of hope. If people in power, people who had once been part of the problem, were now willing to step up and support change, maybe, just maybe, the fight for justice was gaining the ground it needed. In the following weeks, Eleanor and Marcus began to meet with these officers, discussing the role of law enforcement in upholding racial bias and exploring ways to implement real reform. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it wasn't one that would be resolved overnight, but there was a sense of momentum that hadn't been there before. Then came the announcement that Eleanor had been waiting for, a new bill aimed at increasing transparency in law enforcement practices was making its way through Congress. It was a direct result of the conversations she had helped initiate, and it was an important step toward ensuring that what had happened to her and so many others would never happen again. The victory wasn't just in the passage of the bill, it was in the realization that the conversation had expanded. People were now talking about systemic injustice in a way that they hadn't before. The change wasn't just at the top, it was happening at the grassroots level too. For the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to breathe. The fight was far from over, but this victory was a validation of everything they had worked for. It was proof that change was possible, even when it felt like the system was too big to confront. Marcus, always by her side, smiled at her as they sat in their living room that evening. "We've done something good," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Eleanor nodded, her heart swelling with pride. The victory was sweet, but she knew the road ahead would be long. They had opened a door, but there was still so much left to do, and Eleanor was more than ready to keep pushing forward. In the weeks following the success of the bill's introduction, Eleanor found herself busier than ever. Her days were filled with meetings, speaking engagements, and phone calls with politicians, activists, and community leaders. Every conversation was another step toward pushing the needle further on the change they had all been working toward. The momentum was undeniable, but with it came even more resistance. Eleanor had expected the backlash to continue, but what she hadn't anticipated was just how fierce it would become. Those who had once sat silently in the corners, observing the progress from afar, now began to show their true colors. Anonymous threats began to appear, directed not just at Eleanor, but at everyone involved in the movement. Letters filled with hateful language were mailed to her office. Social media became a battleground, with trolls and haters flooding her inbox with venomous comments and personal attacks. But Eleanor had always known that when you fight for something important, resistance was inevitable. Still, it was hard to ignore the personal toll. Every nasty message, every threat, felt like a reminder that they were still fighting against an entrenched system, one that wasn't going to crumble easily. Yet, despite the challenges, Eleanor felt stronger than ever. She had Marcus by her side, and together they were navigating the storm. More than that, she had the support of the countless people who had rallied behind her, people who had seen the importance of what she was fighting for. There was power in that unity, and it fueled her determination. One afternoon, while Eleanor was reviewing some documents for a new initiative, she received a call that made her heart skip a beat. It was from Frank Mitchell, one of the key figures in the movement, who had been working behind the scenes to organize national protests and lobbying efforts. His voice sounded urgent. "Eleanor, there's something we need to discuss," Frank said. "I just got off the phone with a few senators who are backing out of the bill. They're saying the pressure from their donors is too high." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had known the opposition would come, but this was different. Senators pulling support was a direct threat to the progress they had made. What do we do? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice steady. We fight back. We can't let this go without a response. We have to call them out. We have to go public, Frank said firmly. Eleanor nodded, even though Frank couldn't see it. Set up a press conference. We need to let people know what's happening. This is about accountability. Frank agreed, and within hours the press conference was organized. The media would be there, and Eleanor knew this was her chance to bring the truth to light. She prepared herself to speak, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. When the time came, Eleanor stood before the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing as she began to speak. I stand here today because the fight for justice doesn't stop when the cameras turn off or when the donors start pulling back, Eleanor began, her voice steady but full of passion. This bill is not about politics. It's not about money. It's about people. It's about giving a voice to those who have been silenced for far too long. She continued, calling out the senators who were backing out under the pressure of their wealthy donors. She didn't hold back, revealing how corporate interests and the rich elite were trying to silence the movement for equality. The room was silent as Eleanor spoke, and when she finished, there was a moment of stunned quiet. The press conference ended with reporters scrambling to get their questions in, their cameras still flashing. Eleanor knew this moment would change the conversation once again, but she also knew it was only a small victory in a much larger fight. Later that evening, Marcus stood beside Eleanor as they reflected on the day's events. "You did it, Eleanor," he said softly, his hand on her shoulder. "You made them listen." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet resolve. "It's not over yet," she said, "but we've shown them that we're not going anywhere. The movement is stronger than ever." The fight was far from over, but as Eleanor stood with Marcus, she knew one thing for certain: they were winning. The fight for justice was about persistence, and she would never stop pushing till change was not just promised but achieved. The air in the White House had felt heavier than usual as Eleanor and Marcus left the Oval Office. Their meeting with the president had been a turning point, but the words spoken there weighed on Eleanor. While the president had promised support, the caution in his voice reminded her that change would not come easily. Still, something had shifted. The conversations had started. That was all she needed. This was only the beginning. The media had covered the meeting in detail, and the nation's eyes were on them now, more than ever. But the fight wasn't over. They had made progress, yes, but they still had miles to go. The promise of the president's support was a crucial victory, but how that support would manifest remained uncertain. Weeks passed in a blur of meetings, discussions, and strategizing. The public's pressure continued to build, and the opposition, as expected, fought back. Every inch of progress felt like it came at the cost of 1,000 setbacks. Every step forward was met with resistance, from the media to political insiders. Some of the strongest critics came from members of Congress who privately told Marcus and Eleanor that the idea of comprehensive reform was too radical, too divisive. It was clear that the country wasn't ready to move as fast as Eleanor wanted. But Eleanor was unrelenting. There was one afternoon when she sat down with Frank, Sarah, and a few other key allies in a small conference room. The weight of the situation was starting to show in their faces. It had been months since the incident at the gala, and the pressure to push forward had intensified. They were all feeling the exhaustion. But there was one thing that kept them focused: the knowledge that what they were fighting for was more than just a cause. It was the future of a country that had long been built on inequality. "We can't back down now," Eleanor said, her voice steady as she addressed the room. "We've made too much progress. We have the momentum, and we can't let it slip through our fingers. The president is on board, and we're closer than ever. But we need to keep fighting. We need to make them Here is. Frank nodded in agreement. You're right, Eleanor. We've come too far to stop now. We've got support in places we never expected, and it's not just the government anymore. The people want this. We've seen it in the protests, the conversations. People are waking up. It wasn't just about legislation anymore. It wasn't about policies or committees. It was about the people. And for the first time, it felt like they were not just demanding change. They were creating it. It was becoming a movement, a cultural shift that could no longer be ignored. A few days later, the final version of the bill was ready. It had been a long process of compromises, discussions, and reworkings, but it had finally come to fruition. Eleanor stood alongside Marcus and Frank as they presented the bill to the press. She looked out over the sea of reporters, knowing that this moment would be pivotal. This was the moment when the conversation would shift from talking about change to actually implementing it. She stepped up to the podium and addressed the press, her voice filled with conviction. Today we take a stand, she began, her words ringing out clear and strong. Today we fight for equality, for justice, for a future where no one is discriminated against because of their race. We've come together, black and white, young and old, and we've shown that we can make change happen. This bill represents not just a piece of legislation, but a movement that will continue to grow, to push forward, until justice is not just an ideal, but a reality for all. The press conference was a success, and the following days were filled with the kind of media coverage they had hoped for. The bill was passed, but the battle wasn't over. Eleanor knew that now, more than ever, was the time to keep pushing. The bill was a victory, but there was still much more to be done. As Eleanor stood at the front of the room, surrounded by the people who had supported her all along, she felt a sense of accomplishment. But more than that, she felt the weight of the future. The road ahead was long, and the fight wasn't over. But she knew one thing. They had made history, and that history would pave the way for a future of true equality. Eleanor looked at Marcus, who smiled at her, proud and full of resolve. He had been by her side through every step of this journey, and now, together, they had achieved something monumental. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in years, Eleanor felt that the world was ready to listen, and with that, the next chapter of their movement had begun. The momentum from the press conference had carried them through the next few weeks, but the real challenge was yet to come. The support for the bill had grown, but so had the resistance. The powerful forces backing the senators who had backed out were relentless. Eleanor, Marcus, and their team had expected pushback, but the extent of it was something they hadn't fully prepared for. As Eleanor spent the next few days meeting with key allies in the Senate and local governments, she realized just how deeply rooted the system of inequality was. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was an entire network of interests that profited from maintaining the status quo. From private prisons to corporate lobbying groups, every inch of progress was met with a wall of opposition built by those who stood to lose the most. But Eleanor was undeterred. She knew that the fight for racial justice wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. Each victory, no matter how small, was a step in the right direction. Still, there were moments when she questioned how long it would take for real change to come. One morning, Marcus came to her with a piece of news that made her heart race. "The president called," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and caution. "They want to meet. They want to discuss the bill and the movement." Eleanor was taken aback. The president had been largely silent on the issue, and while she knew the White House couldn't stay neutral forever, she hadn't expected this level of engagement. "Are you sure?" she asked, still processing the information. "What do they want to discuss?" Marcus nodded. "They want to understand how to address the public outcry. The momentum is growing and they can't ignore it anymore. but I think they're also trying to gauge our position before they make a formal statement. The news was both exciting and intimidating. A meeting with the president could change everything, but it also meant walking a fine line between achieving progress and compromising too much. The stakes had never been higher. That afternoon, Eleanor and Marcus flew to Washington, D.C. The meeting was set for the following morning in the White House. As they entered the Oval Office, Eleanor felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She had spent years building up to moments like this, but the reality of it, the power that was sitting across from her, was overwhelming. The president, flanked by his advisors, greeted them warmly, but with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the situation. After the pleasantries, the president got straight to the point. "We've been following the progress of your movement," the president said, his tone measured. "And we understand the need for reform. But I need to know where you stand. What do you want from us, and what are you willing to compromise on?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "We want meaningful change. We want laws that hold law enforcement accountable. We want policies that ensure equality in every aspect of life: housing, education, employment, and beyond. And we won't stop until that happens." The president listened carefully, nodding occasionally. Eleanor could sense his advisor's discomfort as she laid out the terms. This wasn't just about a few reforms or symbolic gestures. It was about systemic change, the kind of change that would challenge the very foundations of how power was distributed in the country. "We're committed to change," the president said after a long pause, "but I need you to understand something. The opposition is fierce. We're up against powerful interests, and the political landscape isn't what it used to be. We need to be strategic." Eleanor knew the president's words weren't empty. The political landscape had indeed shifted, and every step forward would be met with resistance. But she wasn't interested in compromise, not when so many had already been left behind for so long. "We've waited long enough for change," Eleanor replied firmly, "and waiting any longer isn't an option." The room was quiet for a moment as the president processed her words. He nodded again, his expression somber. "We'll work with you," he said, "but we need to find a way to move forward that doesn't tear the country apart. There's a fine line between progress and division." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a brief glance. They knew the president's concern was legitimate, but the time for talking was over. The president's office had the power to push through significant change. Now it was up to them to ensure that it wasn't just talk. As they left the meeting, Eleanor felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She had known from the beginning that the road to justice wouldn't be easy, but each challenge was a reminder of why they were fighting in the first place. The meeting with the president was a step forward, but it was only one step. There were more battles to be fought, more walls to break down. But Eleanor knew that they were closer to real change than ever before.